Thank you very much, Susie, for that lovely introduction. I thought today what I would like to do is share with you my experience of integrating mathematical modelling and mathematical modellers into national malaria control programmes with the objective of supporting the national malaria elimination strategy. So I thought I would start by talking about what a mathematical model is and how it can be used in the context of malaria transmission and elimination. So really a mathematical model is a simplified description of a system or process. So for example, it would be a simplified description of the malaria transmission route in a particular country or setting, and its description is written in mathematical language. So the process that a modeler goes through is to start with a real-world problem and a real question, and then we distill the key elements of that real-world system, and particularly what interests mathematical modelers is the interaction between dynamical systems that are in that process. So for example, if I'm infected with malaria in a village, then my risk via the mosquito to infect other people is only part of the story, because it's my level of infection combined with the level of infection in the entire village that then infects the population of mosquitoes, which then go on to infect the next people in the village. Therefore, if I'm at risk of being infected by malaria, that risk depends on how many people were infected about a month ago, because they contributed to the amount of infection in the mosquitoes. So my risk, my infection contributes to the risk, but my risk of getting infection is derived from the population itself. So there's a feedback loop, and it's non-linear. So if nobody's infected, my risk is 0. If everybody or half the village is infected, my risk is really high. So it's this sort of thing. And then if you layer on environmental and ecological components, you can have the dynamic or changing throughout the year of the rainy season, how that affects the mosquito population and therefore the biting rate, which interferes with the transmission process as well to create peaks in the high season. So that's an example of the sort of process that a modeler would go through, is to understand the dynamical system that they're dealing with, to understand a key question about that system, and then develop a mathematical model to simulate that system and to try and answer the question. So once we've developed the mathematical model written in equations, we can then create a simulation of the real system. We confirm that whether that simulation is a good, valid simulation or not by comparing to the real data. And then what the most exciting thing about this sort of process is to simulate forwards in time. So to try and answer questions about the system, about what would happen if it changed. So for example, what would be the expected impact of a particular intervention that's on the table that a malaria control programme is considering? What would be the cost of that strategy, and would that cost would change over time, quite possibly, depending on the way that it impacts the transmission. So if you have a very effective control, say active case detection, and cases are found at the beginning, you're finding a lot of cases and you're treating them, so you've got the attendant costs that go with treating a lot of cases. But as the transmission comes down, which the model can predict, then you would also expect the cost of treatment to reduce along with it. So these are all sort of interactive, dynamical systems. And then this is another interesting one that we find ourselves doing a lot, which is the counterfactual. So what would happen if you don't do this planned intervention? Or what would you expect to happen if, in fact, all the current interventions are withdrawn? So this is a comparison. So what would be a good way to control the disease or eliminate the disease, and then compare that with the counterfactual, or at least one counterfactual. So we're still in maths world here, simulating in the future, imagining what might happen using mathematical models. And then I think one of the most challenging steps for mathematicians and for mathematical modelers is to then get our results back into the real world system and to apply, to actually have the results become useful, understandable and applicable in the real world. And so that's one of the things I'm going to focus on today. So first of all, malaria is caused by parasites in the blood. It's transmitted from person to person through mosquitoes. I've been focusing on malaria in Asia, and although most of the malaria burden is in Africa, but the worrying situation in Asia is that in the past, resistance to anti-malarial drugs has emerged in Asia and has spread to Africa. And here's an example of resistance to a particular drug, SP, starting on the east coast of Africa and then spreading over time, over about a decade, across the entire continent. So this has happened with a number of different drugs. With this one it was observable, and we're currently faced with the new family of very effective anti-malarial drugs, the artemisinin. Artemisinin resistance has already emerged in Cambodia and in other parts of Asia, and the question is now, will it spread to Africa, and what will be the sort of public health and economic burden of such a spread? So that's why I'm interested in Asia, because although the burden is low, what happens in Asia could have a very significant impact on what happens in Africa, where the burden is high. So just to give you an example of where mathematical modelling has been used in the past, in 2006 there were new guidelines from the WHO, who recommended artemisinin combination therapy in all endemic areas globally. In 2008, the Rollback Malaria programme was launched, and the Global Malaria Action Plan, with this new aim, which is aligned with national elimination of malaria in lots of countries. And then that very year, the beginnings of artemisinin resistance were reported in Cambodia. So one of the major tools for achieving this aim were starting to be lost in 2008. That was around the time that I gave up my Muay Thai career and started doing mathematical modelling again. And so in that, what we did there was we produced a mathematical model. Here's a schematic of it. I'm happy to discuss the details of that model afterwards, if you like. But that is a simple mathematical model to compare the transmission of sensitive artemisinin-sensitive malaria and artemisinin-resistant malaria under selection pressure by treatment of clinical cases. And so we produced this mathematical model and ran it forward into the future to explore potential elimination strategies or potential control strategies for this artemisinin-resistant situation. And what we found from the models, what we predicted from the models, was because the artemisinin resistance was not 100%. Basically, it manifested itself as a reduced efficacy, which meant that people would still clear their parasites under treatment, but it would take longer to clear them than those who are carrying a sensitive infection. So that created, if you treated a lot of people, that created a selective niche for the resistant infections. If we simulated what was observed, then what we found was that you could still use ACTs to eliminate malaria in Cambodia. That was our prediction. But that in so doing, you would reduce the absolute numbers of resistant infections. So this is numbers of resistant infections here. You would reduce their numbers in such an elimination strategy, but that the relative proportion of all infections that were resistant would increase. So this is what we call the last man standing idea, that if you're going to eliminate malaria, the last infections will be the most resistant. So we proposed this concept, and at the time the WHO guidelines were suggesting that interventions should be sought that would reduce the proportion of resistant infections. Those guidelines were changed after this model result was released. It may or may not have had an influence on those change of guidelines, and also since then the Cambodian Ministry of Health have developed a national strategic plan for malaria elimination. So challenges for eliminating malaria in this part of the world. If we're going to produce mathematical models to simulate malaria in Asia, then especially if we want to have an impact on policy making, the first thing we need to make sure is in our models is cost. So as soon as we propose with our NMCP partners, our Malaria Control Programme partners, a certain strategy, the next question from them is, okay, how much will it cost? So we integrate costs and economics into our transmission dynamic models. Then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, drug resistance is very important. Drug resistance should be included into these mathematical models, otherwise they are not relevant for the Asian setting. Vector control is a major intervention in everywhere in the world, and we need to include that. Particularly in Asia, spatial heterogeneity is a feature of transmission of malaria. So malaria tends to transmit in transmission foci, where you can have, on average, a very low transmission for the whole country or for the whole area, but then you'll have pockets of extremely high transmission. And we're not entirely sure how that couples with population movement and how those two together, combined with the logistics of a rollout of an intervention, how those will combine together. Will it make elimination more difficult or more easy? I think it depends on the design of the strategy, and that's the subject that we are currently exploring. And then there's seasonality, of course. Malaria risk is not the same, biting rates are not the same throughout the year, and those patterns are not the same from one country to the next. Host level differences and heterogeneities, people respond differently to treatment depending on their genetics. So that is nowhere near an exhaustive list of all the factors that one could include in a malaria elimination model for Asia. However, we are also dealing with a situation where the data are quite sparse. So we don't have very much data on drug resistance. We're getting more and more as time goes on, but we certainly don't have things like the monthly incidence of sensitive cases versus resistant cases. We do have monthly incidence of cases, but then we don't know how many people reported their case, and we don't know how that's clinical malaria. We don't know how much asymptomatic malaria is in the country, except for a few snapshot cross-sectional surveys. And we really don't know very much at all about population movement yet, although there are studies ongoing at the moment to try and measure population movement. And it's interesting for malaria because we don't actually care where anyone goes or what they do during the day. It's only at night. So we're specifically interested in where people spend the night. They don't usually like telling you that. We're facing a challenge where we've got a lot of important interacting factors, not necessarily all the data to go with it. Even in an ideal world where you had the perfect data set and you perfectly understood how all these factors fit together, writing that model would take a good few years. Fitting it to data would take even longer.
Why did you say it would take years?
My experience is that writing, for example, a spatially heterogeneous model, we have to understand and think a lot about how we're going to move people around. So one option is to write an individual-based model. So I guess maybe it might not take some people years. It took us years to get this far. But there's an individual-based model you could write which allows people to move around. But then the trade-off there is that in order to run it quickly for a large population, you need a huge amount of computing time and power. So what we found is that in our group, with the facilities that we can have an individual-based model that's got a lot of these elements in it. We can run it for about 1 million people in a reasonable time frame. So then, if you can't use an individual-based model, but you do want to have population movement and spatial heterogeneity, then you need to come up with some good simplifications and models of the model. So what we use is a compartmental system, and then we have a multi-patch system where you have the same model replicated in multiple patches, and we assume that people behave similarly in each patch but different from each patch, and then we link the patches together, and so that one has taken a while to develop as well, but then that can be used from sort of multiple villages up in terms of population sizes. And then if you want to also develop, so there's sort of almost like radial sort of lines of complexity. So the resistance, the anti-malarial resistance aspect of the model, you could just have two types. You could have people who are sensitive and people who are resistant. But actually, in reality, what we're dealing with is a situation where you have artemisinin resistance, and then you can get resistance to the partner drug that's partnered in the combination therapy. But then, of course, you have to then allow for double resistance, which has actually emerged in Cambodia as well. So now you've got 4 types of resistance, 4 strains that you need to model: sensitive, resistant to artemisinin, partner drug, both. And then there's lots of different artemisinin combination therapies as well. So there's different partner drugs. So you could spend quite a long time just doing a really good model of resistance and ignoring the spatial heterogeneity altogether. So I think that's the challenge, is getting the right level of complexity in each of these submodels and then combining them together, and I think that's what takes all the time. But on the other hand, we can write models that are really, you could write one in an afternoon, but it wouldn't look like, it wouldn't have all of that in it. It would focus on a specific aspect. And so what we find is that I've also been spending a lot of time talking with national malaria control programs, meeting with them, convincing them that modelling is a good idea, that it could be helpful, and they're interested in using this as a tool to support their strategies. But then what I found is that I convince them that modelling's a good idea, and they say, great, we're writing our elimination strategy next week. Can you run your model for that for next week? And I'm thinking, well, I haven't written it yet. So there's sort of, I end up in this situation most of the time, which is, this is the model I would like to write, the one that would take years, and it would be beautiful, and it would be very user-friendly. And so anyone, there'd be a really nice user interface, and anyone could drive it, and it would look really cool. And but then what actually happens is that we don't have time. We never have time to do that one. So we end up cobbling something together to answer the question in the time we have, with all the attendant caveats about what we've had to skim over and skip over. And so this is what we get most of the time. So it sort of more or less runs. It can get you from A to B, but you probably need a mechanic driving it. So yeah, this is what I'm driving most of the time. And that's what it looks like. So that's a simple model. There's only a few equations there. It's for one homogeneous population. And so I could talk you through the equations, but I'm sure you don't want me to. But please tell me if you do. I'm happy to. Yeah, great. So each of these equations represents a state in which an individual in the population can be in terms of infectious disease. So these are the people that are susceptible, they're not infected, and they have no immunity. So these are people that have no memory of a malaria infection. Okay, these I compartments, so they represent S for susceptible. ds by dt, it means the rate of change of susceptibles with time. So with all of these sorts of models, what we're interested in is how they change. And so we even express the equations in that format. How does S change with time? Well, people can be born susceptible, that's this term. People can die of natural causes. And how else can they leave being susceptible? Well, they get infected, which is this term here. And in this model as well, we allow for a loss of immunity. So you get more susceptible people by them losing immunity in the absence of challenge. And then here we've had to split the infected group into 4 different classes. So we have, these are the ones that are usually, These are the ones that usually go and get treatment. So these are the clinical infections. And so you assume that some people get clinically infected, and the proportion of those people that are clinical once infected depends on whether they've come from the S state or the R state, where they have some immunity. So in malaria, we assume that people are never fully protected from infection, they're only protected from clinical disease. And then some of these clinical people can get severe infection. So we record severe infections as well, a very tiny amount of those. And then we have the asymptomatic infections here. So these are the engine that drive transmission in these models, rather than the clinical cases, which are the ones you observe. And then we've also, most recently, based on research all over the world, has shown that there is a huge class of people that are submicroscopic. So even though they're testing negative by conventional tests like microscopy or rapid test, they are actually they're carrying malaria, and they can transmit it as well. So this is even people that are undetectable by traditional methods. So those are the different infectious classes. So all of these in a normal surveillance system in, say, Cambodia, these are unobserved. You don't observe any of that. What is observed are these two treatment compartments here. So if a person is infected and they become clinical and they seek treatment from the health system, the public health system, then you see them, then they're recorded as a case. And so in Cambodia there are two recording systems: the village malaria worker system, where people go and see their village malaria worker when they're sick. Village malaria worker tests them, and if they're positive they treat them, or they go to their local health centre. And so we've got both of these compartments here. So this bit, this tip of the iceberg, this is what's normally observed. And these are for the force of infection. This is a combination of these terms which allow you to bypass the mosquito. In this model, we don't model the mosquito explicitly. We say we assume that the people that get infected now their risk is based on how many people were infectious a month ago, or that processing time through the mosquito population. So there are multiple timescales for malaria elimination. And because it takes a long time to get a model that's useful at this stage, we can actually help along the way, and we can sort of piggyback on this multiple time scale to support each step of the process with mathematical models. So there's the control phase, where that huge pool of asymptomatic malaria cases is not reduced. So what countries are doing in the control phase is they're finding and treating all the malaria cases, the clinical cases. But since they represent such a small proportion of all cases, transmission isn't really impacted all that much. So at that point, you can even use a model that doesn't have any transmission dynamics in it at all. You can use a static model, of which there are many, and also it's very easy to incorporate health economics at that stage. So there's a lot of analyses and health economic analyses that can be done to support this phase. Then once you're moving into pre-elimination, you need the model that I just described, which is the compartmental model. So this is where you still want to look at quite large populations. You can make quite a few simplifying assumptions, but what you do want to allow for is that the interventions that are being deployed can actually impact transmission and change the risk of infection. So, and then that sort of cycle continues. You want to be able to model that and then exploit it. So there's that phase, and that's where you use compartmental models, which are harder to write. They take a bit longer to write in order to feed back to the stakeholders. So this is, I've put this in because we're training people at the moment, and so they represent a step, a sharp increase in the learning curve for a trainee to get to this stage. And then to actually get to the end game, where interventions and transmission is almost at the individual level. So certain interventions are to what do you do when you find one clinical case in a village? Now, in order to simulate and answer some of those questions with models, we need an individual-based model, and again, that's another step in the learning curve for a trainee, because at that point they have to be able to program. So at this stage they can get away with using packages that are pre-written, but then when they get to this stage they really need to be able to program themselves. So this is just a quick slide to show how we've been functioning so far in the group, which is really satisfying way to work, because we have this suite of models that are constantly under development, with the ultimate aim being that flying car. So what we do is every time we get some new data from our colleagues at Macdon Oxford Research Unit, we update our models. We update the structure, or we improve the way they fit to the data, and we can also interact with our colleagues there to feed back to them and say, well, actually, this part of the biology that we're trying to model, we don't have any data for it. It's not been measured. And sometimes they are able to and have the resources to do those experiments and feed back the data. So it's a two-way street, and it's been a very interesting process. And on top of that, we have another feedback loop, which is with the beneficiaries of the model, the national malaria control programs. And what we tend to find is that they'll give us some questions, and when we try and answer them with the modelling, it usually leads to more questions, which again is quite an enjoyable process, because it's sort of a learning process. We're learning about their system and what their challenges are and what their aims are, and at the same time they're learning what the capabilities of the methodology are, and then new questions occur to them based on what they've seen so far. So we've got these two feedback loops, and one thing that I think is really important if modelling is going to be used to support malaria elimination is that we ensure sustainability. So one project in Bangkok that finishes in 2017, I don't think is going to be much use in the long run, because things move on and the models that you produce might not be useful in a few years' time. You need to adapt them. So that's why I've been focusing some of my time on training and capacity building, with the idea of embedding mathematical modelers in each of the malaria control programs, so that they can do this themselves. So these are our trainee modelers. So this is Pengbi in Cambodia, this is Petsuan in Laos, this is Shisul in South Africa, Shui Sin in Myanmar, Sajid and Jahirul in Bangladesh, and Windsor in Myanmar. And so these guys are at various stages in their training. They've been recruited mostly from their malaria control programs, and we're training them up in all of these concepts that I've just been talking about. So, for example, I'm very hopeful that these guys will go back after their training. They'll re-enter into their malaria control program with this new skill and capability that will support the system. There is a precedent for this. For example, the Modelling and Economics unit of the PHE in the UK. And I don't see why it shouldn't happen in other countries, in developing countries. The only barrier to this is training, because the cost of a modeller is relatively low. They don't need a lot of equipment. They just need to have a good training and a good laptop, and then they can have. My feeling is that they could probably earn what they cost by saving and sort of streamlining intervention strategies. This guy here, Dr. Jahirul, so he's managed to get a sabbatical from his post. He's the deputy head of the malaria control program in Bangladesh. So I'm hoping that he tells me he's going to be using modelling when he returns to his job in a few years' time. So I was going to go through a few examples, but I'm a bit concerned about time. So I just mentioned this, which is the South African situation where the data were modelled until this time and then projected onwards. And this is also multiple patches. And so that was an interesting result from Sheetal, where she was looking for elimination strategies for South Africa, and she found that probably the most effective strategy would be to spend all their money helping Mozambique, because it's the source of all the malaria infection in those areas. So that was an interesting result. That's part of her PhD. And so the next step is to actually put some dollar signs on that and collaborate with her control program. So there's a very early stage individual-based model being developed by my Cambodian trainee, Pengbin Ngor. And so Cambodia is the end game in a lot of villages, and he's particularly interested in what do you do when you see one case, when elimination has already occurred? How do you respond when one case arrives in a village? And I think the reason why he wanted to go straight to that most difficult problem is because in his former job he travelled around to a lot of these villages training the village malaria workers, and so he understands what the challenges are going to be at that stage, at the end game. So I think that leads me on to my point that it's been really interesting training these new modellers, and because of where we recruited them from, they've had a different perspective on what questions to answer first, and the models that they've developed have been bespoke for their settings, and they've understood the social, logistical and economic challenges of their own countries. And I think it's been interesting to see them come at it from the other direction. Normally you have people with a modelling skills, and then they're learning about the country that they're applying them to. So we're trying it the other way around here. To conclude, mathematical modelling is being used, and the demand is increasing for models to support malaria elimination. And I think we can meet that demand by training modellers who will be embedded in their national malaria control programmes. I'd like to thank my collaborators from the Mahidol Oxford Research Unit and at Mahidol University, my malaria control programme partners and NGO partners, and also the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you.